the idea of this session is really to walk you through some of the things that Salamander Active Directory and also our other products, Salamander SharePoint, can do in terms of managing multi-tenant installations for multi-academy trusts or larger enterprises, local authorities, things like that. I know that most of you are already customers for Salamander Active Directory anyway, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking through the product that we normally give to people. So this is an idea. This is just to give you an idea of some of the things that we do for some of our larger customers with 20, 30, 40, 50 schools and so on, and some of the deployment options we've got around how we handle those kind of installations and how the general infrastructure works. So I'll spend a couple of minutes just looking at the actual product itself. So as most of you know, the Salamander Active Directory was built just under 10 years ago now, originally designed to create users and groups in a local Active Directory, and over the past few years has expanded somewhat with the developments in Office 365 and G Suite. So obviously the key element still is the creation of users and groups in Active Directory locally. But we're also seeing an increasing number of schools and entities looking at just creating users and groups directly in their Azure tenant or in their Google tenant, especially once we get into the multi-academy trust kind of situation. We have, simply because of the complexity of some of the trusts and how they've come along, we actually have a lot of deployment models that are available for people. So we have a number of entities that are working with a single Active Directory per school, which works perfectly well, but then they have a centralized Azure or G Suite tenant with separate user accounts, and we can provision directly into those as well if we want to. Most of the trusts we work with are working with a single Active Directory domain which has got the entire trust in it, and then usually that's linked out to a single Office 365 tenant or a G Suite tenant. And we have some that are a mixture of both. We've got some that have all the primary schools on a single tenant, and all the secondaries are running their own tenant. So there's really a number of options that we can work with around all of that stuff. As most of you know, obviously we've got the calendar synchronization and the group synchronization into Office 365 and into G Suite as well. The calendar sync works with Exchange 2007 onwards, essentially. Although we're beginning to see a lot more now moving into Active Directory, into Office 365. We then have stuff like we've got the class notebooks, which is a very popular feature these days. We're spending a lot of time provisioning class notebooks and staff notebooks now in Office 365 for our schools, both individual schools and also for multi-academy trusts as well. And that's something that's really piquing the interest of many people. And that's all of these things are things that we can do either as a single tenant or up to any kind of scale, really. The largest deployment we have using this currently about 50 schools, but the largest deployment we have of Active Directory in general is over 1,400 schools in a single deployment with a single Active Directory. So we can scale really from, we've got a number of trusts that are 2 or 3 schools all the way up to quite large numbers. Certainly the most recent feature that we've been looking at and that schools have taken up with us is the Microsoft Classroom and School Data Sync feature. As a lot of you know, Microsoft Classroom is still in preview, but there's a lot of development going on around that, and School Data Sync was released and became generally available to schools just before the BET show, so very early, mid-January that came out, and it is now available for use. We work with both School Data Sync and Microsoft Classroom. And all of our products can take all of our customers can take advantage of both of those as well. If you've not looked at School Data Sync at all, it's something that you should probably take a bit of a look at. I covered very briefly some stuff around School Data Sync in the Office 365 webinar that we did a few weeks ago. But it's definitely worth a look at because it's going to start getting used by a lot more third-party companies for their Office 365 apps, and if you're interested at all in Intune for Education, it's also worth looking at because the data that School Data Sync takes is also going to be used by Intune for Education, which will allow for much more granular device management and those kind of things. So that's definitely worth a look at if it's not something you're already using. And that's School Data Sync is free, obviously. The other thing we're doing, it's not really related to the multi-tenant build, but I thought I'll mention it anyway, is we're releasing what will be a free utility for any school. It's not just for our customers, it'll be a free utility for any school to extract the data that they need from their MIS system and provision it into School Data Sync. Currently, School Data Sync in the UK is only available by uploading CSV files from your local system, and creating those in the format that SDS likes from your MIS can be quite complicated. So we're building a free utility that will allow schools to do that. In the initial period, that will be available for SIMS, Progresso and Facility CMIS customers. And then we're hoping to expand that to other MIS systems over time. We're hoping that's going to be available in the next month or so. So if that's something of interest, keep an either ping me or keep an eye on the website, and we'll announce that kind of stuff once we're ready. Excuse me. So I'll kind of talk a little bit about the multi-tenant stuff now. So we've got a number of deployments, and it varies quite spectacularly, really, depending where we go and what schools we're in. So what is most important really is we don't have a set model. We can work with a number of different deployments. In fact, I think I tallied up yesterday while I was preparing for this that we've got about 7 different deployment methods at the moment, depending on each individual site. So we don't really force a particular model. We can work around what's currently in place and where the trust or the entity really want to go. But what I'll talk about here is the 2 most common scenarios that we're seeing. The first one is where the trust or the enterprise has a single Active Directory with all of their schools in, and all of the MIS systems for those schools are available from a single server. So the idea there being that you have, if you had, say we've got 5 schools that are running SIMS, we can install our product on one box inside the network and access all 5 of those SIM servers across a WAN or via VPNs and things like that. What that means is we can then have a single installation of our product that manages all 5 of those schools, so you're not managing 5 different installations of the software. That means you can get a little bit more standardized around how you're doing things, and in terms of managing the provisioning solution, you're only managing 1 application, not 5. And again, depending on how you scale that, the largest deployment we've got using this method currently has got 35 schools in it. And so you end up with any small changes you want to make, you can make centrally very, very quickly and have them apply to all 35 schools, rather than having to go and manage 35 different installations. This can then work with your Office 365 and your G Suite tenants. And in most cases, we're finding that where there's a single Active Directory, which has got every school in it, there's also invariably a single Office 365 tenant, which handles all of that for all of those schools as well. But we could work in environments that are slightly different to that. We have one environment where we have an Active Directory with a single domain with every single school in separate OUs, but each of those schools has got its own Office 365 tenant. There are some considerations to be had around how you manage usernames and how you sync the users from your Active Directory to Office 365 in those scenarios, but it is something that we can work with. The other most common deployment we've got is what we essentially call the client-server model, where we're working with enterprises that are, or trusts that are quite often nationwide. They don't necessarily have a big wireless network that all of their schools can connect to. We've got some schools that are quite rural as part of the entity, and they just don't have the ability to put the VPNs in that they really need, and an open WAN or some form of lease line is just not really an option for them. So what we have in that instance is a client that sits inside the school, pulls the data locally, and then sends that via the internet via a secure service to an externally facing web service, which sits centrally, and then that data is then picked up by our processes and provisioned into the single Active Directory or out into something like an Azure tenant, something like that. So the most recent scenario we did for those was a build we did back in January, where each of the schools has got their own local Active Directory, but the trust are building a separate email provision which is based on Office 365, which will be done with separate users not tied to their local Active Directory, which again is mostly down to the way that the schools are, and their remoteness means that it's very difficult to manage a centralized Active Directory and that kind of thing. So what we actually do is we provision the local Active Directory with a tool that sits on the server, and then we send a copy of that information up to a central server via the web service, which is then provisioned separately into an Azure tenant. It's a slightly unusual scenario, but again, that's something that we can work with. And I think the key point to take away from this is that we don't have a fixed model. We can work with many different ideas and enterprises, and what we actually do is we look at building the solution that's right for your environment rather than having you change your environment to suit what our product can do. We're much more keen to work with you on exactly what you've got, where you need to be, where you want to go, and then we can work on what the right solution is for your specific situation, because obviously there are lots of different potential scenarios, especially if we were looking at larger trusts working with a number of different primaries, secondaries, some special schools and so on. It gets the requirements in a primary school are not the same as they are in a secondary school, and quite often the things we need to do need to be a bit more tailored, a bit more bespoke to manage those kind of situations. So that's all stuff we can do. Some of the stuff that we're working on, some of this is actually going to be coming to our, shall we say, standard Salamander Active Directory installations. The first of which is going to be a user interface that we're building to help users inside the school monitor what's going on, really, and keep an eye of the login themselves, and keep an eye of the details of any users that we create. In fact, this is the screenshots on the screen are a beta version that we're releasing to one of our trusts this week, which is going to be the first pilot, and then we're going to start rolling that out hopefully to our normal Active Directory customers fairly soon. But on the multi-tenant side of things, once you're dealing with 10 schools or 20 schools worth of data, all of these things become a lot harder to manage. Currently they're managed, most of our local installations are managed with CSV files, and logs are all written out to text, which is not ideal. So what we're doing with the multi-tenants is we're writing that data into SQL, into a SQL Server database, either locally on the machine or more frequently now into an Azure SQL Server. And the benefits to that obviously are that it's then much more usable, that they can do a lot more work around reporting on that information, and any kind of alerting that the trust wants to do around that. We're also going to build a version of this user interface that will be working specifically with the multi-tenant installations where we're dealing with more than one school, to easily filter and monitor the login and the way that users are managed and those kind of things, and also quite possibly update and certainly view the configuration information for those individual schools, so you can see exactly what's what and what's configured everywhere. What we find with all of the multi-tenant builds that we do is, as standard as people would like their installations to be across all of their schools, invariably there are going to be lots of differences, and certainly most of them are very minor differences, but it's enough. Under normal circumstances, you might have to change what you're doing to accommodate the software, whereas the builds that we're doing are a lot more bespoke. We can tailor every single piece of configuration, be that the type of password that we get, or the username format, or the way that we format the display name. All of those kind of things can be tailored to a school level, and currently that information is quite hard to monitor. So what we're doing is we're building a user interface which will allow schools and trusts to more easily monitor that information and keep a track of where it's at. That's not to say that user interface is going to replace our support services, though. We still have a team. In fact, it's a growing team. The reason I'm working from a hotel at the moment is we're in the process of training our latest support member of staff who started on Monday. And we're working through expanding the support team and expanding what we can do and their knowledge around all of these things. So although we're building the user interface to support our customers and help what you guys are doing around monitoring and using these things, we're also putting a lot of investment into our support services to make sure that the level of support we can offer to trusts and individual schools stays as high as it can possibly be. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about the reporting side of things. So because we're now logging the data into SQL, there's then lots of options around how schools monitor these. These are actually samples that we've done for somebody else, but the trust that's going to get the first version of the multi-tenant installation is working with Power BI quite heavily, and they're starting to build some dashboards based on the data that we're providing to them in SQL. And they're taking that information and then turning that into trends and alerts, and they have their own dashboards in their office. They keep a dashboard of all the services that are running on a couple of big screens in the office, and what they're now doing is they're incorporating some of our information into that. So at a glance, they'll get a list of the schools that are running that might have issues or errors or warnings and those kind of things, so they can very quickly drill down into what's going on. Once the data's in SQL, obviously you can do what you want with it. So these screenshots are just from a Power BI sample that we've done. But you could use if you're using SSRS or any other kind of reporting services, you'd be able to take that data and use that stuff yourself. As it stands, we're not looking to push any form of reporting. What we will do, though, is provide samples for a few different types of reporting services that Trust might use. And then you can incorporate that into your own processes. The user interface build that we're looking to push for multi-tenant builds in the longer term, probably not the first release, will also build some form of reporting in there as well, and allow you to export this data into some form of graphs and useful information like that. Excuse me. And to be fair, that's really it. I didn't want to. I mean, I could spend 3 hours talking about this stuff, and I know there'd be nobody left on the call at the end of it, so I'm not going to bother trying to do that. What I really wanted to do was just show you some of the things that we can do with the builds. But I think the most important thing to say is that we don't have a particular set of things. What I'm very, very keen to talk to people that are working with more than one school. Even if that's 2 schools or 3 schools, all the way up to trusts with 40 or 50 schools, we're very interested in talking to everybody about what they're doing now and what their ideal solution is. Everything we're building is based on the experience that we've got from working with our customers, and what we're really looking for now is to talk to more people about what they're doing and whether what we're providing is actually the right solution for them, or whether we need to do something else and what the other options are. And really, I just want to open some conversations with people around what we can do as a company to support MultiAcademy Trust, because obviously we're seeing more and more trusts spring up. So there's some issues around that. So if you've got any questions, drop those in. Richard's just dropped us a question about yes, okay, so there's issues around API limits. Certainly in Google. Office 365 has some limits on APIs, and the way we're working around those at the moment is they're tied down to the number of calls that a particular user can make at any given time. So in the larger entities, we're actually dealing with more than one service account, essentially. So when we're working with the calendar process, say, we've got a trust that's we've got an entity that's using, there's about 14 to 15,000 users that we process calendars for every day for them. And because of the limits on the APIs that Office 365 has got, we're working with 5 different service accounts. We're essentially splitting the data into 5 chunks and processing them side by side and approaching Office 365 from different angles. The Google ones, the Google API limits are a lot more fixed. They're a lot harder to get around, but we have been working with Google on that, and we've got some we've made some progress with that. And the way that essentially works is in developer terms, in Office 365, in Google Suite, there is what they call projects, and each project has got very strict limits on how many calls it can make into the particular APIs for the classroom and for the users, and for the groups and so on. And what we're now having to do is split our processes up into more and more of those chunks. We're also talking with Google about how they can increase those limits for larger entities and how we can work around that kind of stuff. So the issues around Office 365 we're less worried about. The largest Office 365 tenant we work with has got 700,000 users in it, which is above every single limit that schools normally have when you create an Office 365 tenant. So Microsoft are quite open to talk with trusts and schools around how they can increase those limits and what they can do about that, and they're quite keen to talk to developers as well. G Suite, we've not hit that many. Most of our multi-tenants now are working with Office 365 rather than Google for other reasons other than the API restrictions. They're looking for more granular ways of managing their permissions for emails and those kind of things, which Google isn't currently providing for them. But it is something we're looking at. ETA on the release of the user interface, hopefully certainly by the end of the academic year is the plan. That's where we're going. I don't have a firm date, but what we are looking for, Jim, is some schools to pilot it. So if you want to give it a play, let us know, and as soon as I've got a pilotable version, I can give you that. Send me an email, Jim. That's the way. I will forget. Okay, another question from Richard about, so do you find that multi-academy trusts have the same class groups and registration group names? If they do you prefix the groups with the name code to prevent duplicates? Yes, essentially we do. What we find when we're working with obviously more than one school at once, quite often we find certainly registration groups more than class groups are quite often duplicated. So yes, what we normally do is prefix them with a school code, usually a 3-letter identifier, or some schools or some trusts prefer to use the full DFES code to identify them. Now what we then do is we can have a friendly display name over the top of that, obviously once we're talking about groups, so it's easily searchable and usable, but underneath we have a prefix, and that quite often is the same for any groups, and even some users in some cases. We have a couple of trusts who prefer to prefix their users with particular codes as well, depending what school they're associated with.